Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-hosts Dr. Reid Robison and I discuss the concept of parts work, especially through the lens of internal family systems, or IFS. We explore the concept of internal parts, how this so-called symphony of selves operates. We discuss how parts work can help us live well and flourish. We even talk a bit about how Reid and I have used the parts work concepts to help ourselves as we're trying to make our way through this confusing and wild world. We'll talk a bit about how parts manifest during psychedelic experiences and much, much more. For those of you who are interested in becoming psychedelic therapists, but you don't know where to start, Numinus is offering an 8-week course called The Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy. This course provides education on psychedelic therapy basics, including the core skills needed to facilitate preparation, medicine, and integration sessions. So if you're curious and you want to learn more, go ahead and click the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/hour-training-selection. You can use the code PTF10 for 10% off the price. If you're the kind of person who waits till the last minute to make major life decisions and you haven't decided to sign up for the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver yet, it's not too late. Numinus is still offering an exclusive 20% off discount code to our PTF podcast listeners. So you can click on the link in our show notes and use the code NWI20 at checkout for that 20% off. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and maybe even share the episode with somebody you think might benefit from it. So without further ado, here is our conversation today about parts work, and IFS. Here we are again. It's good to see you, Reid.
Same. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm doing well. Looking forward to the weekend. Looking forward to relaxing. I'm going to a friend's house who has a pool, and I wish I had a pool. Mm-hmm. It's probably better to have friends who have pools than to own a pool. Like you. You've got a pool, right?
Yep. And then right when spring came this year, the pool cover froze. So we couldn't open it for weeks because all the pool cover people were backed up. And
frozen pool covers.
I also didn't realize how expensive those pool cover parts are.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are big problems,
right? Yeah,
to
huge
complain about.
First world problems.
And I'll just give my acknowledgement of pool privilege.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I looking forward to the weekend. But before we get there, I guess we should have a podcast here. Thinking about the topics we've been asked to cover by the listeners, the things that we haven't covered already in our over 100 episodes. We certainly have mentioned the concept of parts, of parts work, especially when talking about internal family systems therapy. You recently went through the level 1, certification or training in IFS. So we talked about parts a lot, but we had never dedicated an entire episode to parts work. And it's become so interesting, relevant, dare say popular in the psychedelic therapy space to use parts work either covertly or overtly. And so, I thought we would talk a little bit about parts.
I like it. It's certainly been helpful not only in client sessions, in psychedelic therapy sessions as well, but personally.
Yeah.
Just getting immersed in this parts way of viewing the world over the past few years has been really useful, especially like when I think the parts work community often likes to call it activated instead of triggered.
I like that. Yeah, I think of the different psychotherapy techniques that I've learned, or the different theoretical orientations to psychotherapy that I've learned over my many years as a psychologist. There have been ones that really, really resonated with me personally, that have been helpful for all my messiness and my wounding and whatever, and self-improvement. The first that I encountered that felt that way was ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy.
I like that.
And it's certainly cognitive behavioral techniques and strategies. The idea of thinking errors. I remember early in my training was like, oh, this is really helpful. I'm biased and this is unhelpful thinking and I can edit and challenge these thoughts, that kind of thing. But then later on, it was emotion-focused therapy, dealing directly with emotions, using two-chair type techniques clinically, and sort of doing that. That was sort of my first encounter with parts, actually, when I was learning, EFT, and my supervisor was encouraging me to do these two-chair or empty chair activities with my clients, where they play the role of a part in one chair, have a conversation with another part of themselves, and then switch. Or they, put their internalized mother or internalized father on the chair, and they talk to them and they express things that they might not be able to express otherwise. And that was really cool, but I wasn't exposed to IFS until fairly recently. I mean, a couple of years ago. And I actually sought out an IFS therapist and had 6 months or so of my own therapy with somebody.
Yeah.
And incredibly useful. Even though some of the guided visualizations at the time I felt like were a little weird. I mean, I'm not personally, I don't use those things personally. I use them with my clients that tend to be pretty helpful, but I haven't found that I connect with guided visualizations really, really well until IFS. I'm going to keep rambling for a second. So I remember my IFS therapist guiding me to connect with I guess what in IFS they might call an exile, a part of me that might be like an inner child who has developed a really, really critical voice. And I won't go into all the details, but to see this part of me as a part of me that had an understandable agenda helped me have a level of self-compassion, like relax into a level of self-compassion that had been really hard for me to achieve before then. So anyway.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting something that I really love about parts work and internal family systems in particular, is just this stance that there are no bad parts. Every part has positive intent for you. There may have been some thoughts and behaviors that developed at a time for protection that are no longer needed now, some outdated coping strategies, if you will. But the no bad parts thing has been extremely helpful for me, especially coming from the eating disorder world, where there are these two really popular books that almost everyone reads called Life Without Ed, where Ed is the personified evil eating disorder. And some people take that. The books aren't really taking a stance of like bad parts in particular, but many people interpret it that way of like eradicate, destroy Ed. But under a parts work framework, you can't really get rid of a part.
Yeah.
Like you could make it go into further hiding. You could make it roar its angry head a little more. But the idea is to kind of love it into the light and give it compassion, understanding, so the parts can act more in harmony.
Yeah, you're giving a good example of what parts work can look like. Maybe we should back up a bit and describe what parts are. So I think and you can correct me where I get this wrong, but the overall concept being that we are comprised, our personalities, our psyches, our souls are comprised of multiple parts. So when you take a personality test like a Myers-Briggs or an Enneagram or whatever, and you get a typology, that typology is describing the music that your symphony of selves tends to play. And all of our parts that are dominant are typically dominant because maybe we didn't get what we needed at a certain important junction in our development as a kid, or we did, right? We have, parts that are nourished and function well or whatever, but it's the combination and the balance of those parts that essentially makes us who we are.
Yeah. And another example is parts can often get stuck in past scenes of trauma or attachment wounds, and often don't know that you've grown older and times have changed, and you have resources to handle things in a different way now.
Right. Yeah, so it's you'll often hear this concept of the inner child, for example, and that's a reference to a part, right? To this part of you that was arrested in development. And this is not unique to IFS, internal family systems. This is fairly common in most psychedelic psychological theories of human development and psychopathology. Even Freud talked about the psychosexual stages, and if you had trauma at any one of these stages, his words were cathect. You cathected this libidinal energy at this stage, and it gets fixed into you have a fixation, an oral fixation, an anal fixation, or whatever.
Those are fun.
Yeah.
They're fun to read about.
Yeah, a little weird, a little odd, but
yeah.
So yeah, this notion that what happens to us when we're young in particular is what would you say is crucial for the development of our internalized family system, our parts.
Yeah. So to summarize, we all have this collection of parts inside of us, and they're not really that ephemeral, like meaning they will show up in a pretty consistent way, even though it's really hard to take an inventory of all your parts at any given time. There are more than you think, but there's this symphony of selves inside of us, and sometimes parts can get conflicted, polarized within this system, and some louder than others for sure. Like a part, when activated, a certain protective part or previously wounded part might take the mic and just dominate the inner dialogue. But the other crucial piece of this to highlight is that we have this capital S self essence, or the capital S self part that is the real force of healing and the real part that we want in the driver's seat. Yeah.
I've because capital S self is for me cumbersome to say. I've started calling this the core self, but it goes by lots of other names and other psychological traditions or faith traditions or whatever.
Self energy or self essence are the most commonly used ones in IFS. And in IFS, so IFS, it's probably important to rewind just for a sec, that internal family systems developed by Dick Schwartz is one of the more recent and, like you said, increasingly popular ways of doing this, and rightly so, because it does make it accessible. Like I trained also in EFT, through the formal level 1 and things like that. And it, even though it has its own unique approach, and I use a lot of EFT, I gained a lot from it, it's harder to get to the point of really doing parts work well. IFS makes it, I think, accessible, with some caveats. You still need to know what you're doing so you don't accidentally trigger protectors to make the work even harder.
Right. Yeah. The client gets entrenched. Yeah, I mean, our friend Paul Thielking, he, I think, been trained in big mind and voice dialogue, another example of a therapy that references parts, certainly Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls,
Jungian
analysis.
Ego state therapy is another big parts one.
Yeah, transactional analysis is another one. So it's, but I agree with you that at least the ones that I've studied, IFS feels pretty accessible, and it feels accessible to my clients too.
Yeah, so this self essence or self energy we all have inside of it has like a universality, and it has the 8 C's in IFS that I find really helpful, because if you can find one or more of these 8 C's, and I'll just list them off here. If you can find those in yourself, it's a sign that your self energy is on board, and that's needed to kind of moderate the conversation and the path towards healing among parts. But
so just to clarify before you list them off, these are the qualities of capital S self leadership. So when you're saying like which part has the microphone or has the steering wheel, this is how you can tell if your core self or the self energy is leading the system. Yeah, and so we want to be self-led. That's the goal. And this capital S self or self essence is our deepest essence. And Dick Schwartz came up with these 8 C's that make it easy to identify when that energy is on board. And they are curiosity, calmness, compassion, clarity, courage, and connectedness. And so when these are present, the self acts as a wise and compassionate leader for the system. Right.
Yeah.
So maybe we could dive in a little bit on each of these C's and talk about what they mean in the context of IFS. So calmness, being one of the C's, I think, is it's the calmness that you might also attribute to equanimity. Like if you're a practiced meditator or you want to be sort of the eye of the storm. the capital S self energy is not unperturbed, but it's calm in the presence of perturbation, maybe.
Yeah, it's able to step back from the frazzled, panic, agitated state. And that's one I look for often, like whether I'm sitting in meditation myself, trying to return to center, aka return to that self essence, is I'll look for that calmness or that equanimity. Just like I'll look for curiosity. Do I want to know more about this activated part, or is that not there yet because I'm too, panicked or
too activated, too defended.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one that has been a challenge for me personally to cultivate. We talked a lot about meditation, of course, and from my own personal meditation practice, calmness is often elusive for me, especially right now in my life, just because I got a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, sometimes I have parts that show up at the stage of consciousness and don't want to be calm. So I'm trying to meet those, as I tell my clients, I'm trying to meet those parts at the threshold of consciousness with self-energy. Like, hey, I talk to them as if they're kids, like as if I would talk to my 10-year-old. Hey there, buddy. How are you? It looks like you have a message for me. You're welcome here, right?
Yeah, and in the IFS level 1 training, they go really deep into what they call the 6 F's of working with protector parts. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we'll get back to this. But the one F that I think is relevant here is the question of how do you feel towards the part?
Yeah.
And whether it's curiosity or compassion, one of the other 8 C's, because if there's that curiosity or compassion or both and some calmness, then that's seen as a green light in the therapy work to forge ahead and start working with that part. But you have to cultivate some self energy first to be able to do that.
Yeah, and when you listen to Dick Schwartz on interviews, he almost always invites the host to engage in an exercise where he guides them through, a visualization. And you can see him peeling off parts as he's asking that question. Okay, how do you feel toward this part that showed up? Well, he's kind of annoyed. Okay, could we ask that annoyed part to step into the waiting room of your consciousness? And it's really fun to see him sort of peel him away as he's charging up self-energy in this person to really, if it's okay with the part and the other parts that are observing, to contact this part and bring that healing aspect of self-energy to it.
It's a model with a lot of consent, inner consent, which I also appreciate and have. It's good to put some kind of conscious attention, awareness, and focus on the need for consent when doing inner work, like and being able to check in with these different parts of if it's okay to keep forging ahead, or if one is getting flooded or just too activated to do any productive work. Yeah,
it's a gentle form of therapy, I think, for that reason. It can be really challenging, but I think with like what you're saying, because there is this overarching attitude of compassion, there are no bad parts, and also consent, like you're saying, it can be a gentle way to approach very, very sensitive things like trauma.
Yeah, and we've talked about it a little bit on here. We haven't dedicated an episode to it, but we could. We've talked about Hakomi therapy, which I did some training in with Hannah last year, and I love Hakomi, but it was interesting to see the intersection of Hakomi and IFS. A lot of former Hakomi therapists have migrated to training in IFS because there's so much like synergy and overlap, and then as I've learned about it more, the two therapies have collaborated a lot. Like in the 90s, a lot of the kind of deeply trained Hakomi therapists and trainers had some influence on IFS of bringing the body into the equation as a resource, and like the way to locate these parts through body sensations, and then the body as a resource to stay with it, but also that gentle approach they share.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So maybe back to the C's. We talked about calmness. You mentioned curiosity. The curiosity being, maybe the Buddhist concept of beginner's mind.
Yeah.
Open, non-judgmental awareness, the kind of curiosity you might have if you're doing a mindfulness meditation or trying to be mindful day to day.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So when you encounter an internal part, you'll know you're in self-energy if you're, feeling any one of these C's, but curiosity is a big one.
And I'll use these just as a practical application. Like you said, this therapy has been really helpful for me personally. And even in ways that don't look much like formal parts work, but like taking the 8 C's, and when I'm sitting in a meditation, whether it's in the morning or a midday kind of reset or a deeper dive at night, I'll look for these things. Like, do I have that curiosity, that mindset that you mentioned has some similarities with this state of mindfulness? Or do I have compassion towards what was activated in the day? Do I have clarity? Like, can I see the big picture?
Yeah. It's a good way to sort of scan your system to see if you're in touch with self-energy or not.
Yeah.
And if not, that's an opportunity to try, like to get curious, see if you can bring some self-energy to the parts that have the microphone. And in my personal experience, they're not always willing to let go of the microphone. Like the other day, I was just feeling super annoyed, and I was trying to what would you tell yourself if you were your own client? Like, let's slow it down. And this annoyed part was like, no, bro, I want to be annoyed right now. Just, make sure you get away from your loved ones so you don't do any damage and breathe through this.
Yeah, and that reminds me of an interesting exercise we did at one of the in-person IFS training retreats. It was called like a U-turn exercise, but you're out there. It was really simple, but it was useful enough that when we did this recent group ketamine cohort here, Hannah and I had people go through it, our group ketamine participants, but it's basically where you see your capital S self sitting in a chair there. Like, you see it embodying across the room from you, embodying all these qualities of self, and you start moving towards it. You want to embody that yourself, and you notice all the things that pull you away from that path or that self-essence, whether it's all the little ways that we get out of our true self throughout the day, or some of the big potholes we step in that derail us. But it's really useful to take an inventory of like what starts to happen as you get out of that self energy, and what are the early warning signs so you can be on the lookout for them and notice when they're happening earlier instead of when you're full blown, activated and out of your window of tolerance.
I'd be curious to know what your early warning signs are for you. I'll as you're thinking, I'll share a few of them, what they are for me. Like, if I am lost in self-critical thought, that's usually early. I mean, maybe not so early, but it's usually a warning sign that, I've got an exile or a protector perhaps who's taken the microphone. If my body feels really, really either tired or on edge, I've been learning to really pay attention to the way my nervous system is behaving, and as an early warning sign that maybe I'm being run too ragged or I'm putting too much pressure on myself. My need or desire to control, to make sure everything is predictable, is often an early warning sign that maybe I'm feeling a little too far outside my comfort zone. So I need to make things clear, concise, predictable, knowable. Those are a few of mine. Yeah,
no, it's fun to reflect on because they certainly come in these themes, not only changing day to day, but we tend to have kind of certain vulnerabilities at different chapters of life. But some that come to mind are just if I'm taking things personally, or if I'm not seeing the big picture, like if I don't have that clarity, or if I'm feeling discouraged, like lacking that other of the 8 C's of confidence. Or if the compassion isn't fully on board, those are early warning signs. In fact, I was listening to this live meditation by Adyashanti. Do you ever follow his work? One of my favorite living kind of Buddhist teachers, and but he was just guiding this process and doing this meditation and discussion around what pulls you out of enlightenment, because we as humans spend probably much or most of our time out of that state. But what starts to happen as you slip out of the place where we all want to remain but don't as humans. And it is really interesting to look at those, especially the early blips, because it's easier to also intervene and gently pull yourself in early in the process of like decompensating.
Yeah. Which, it makes the process of learning about the organization of your internal family system important, but also, at least for me, really interesting, which helps with the curiosity piece. But getting to know myself through this lens, this perspective of parts, has been one of the most helpful things for me personally in my own journey that I've learned in recent years.
Yeah, that's saying a lot.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Given that I've dedicated my life to studying this stuff, right? So maybe some of the other C's, we don't have to dive too deep because I do want to get to a few other points here. But so clarity, curiosity, compassion, confidence. You mentioned, confidence that you can handle the activations as they occur. And I think some of the confidence comes from the relationship of trust built between your capital S self and these other parts. And that's part of the therapy too. Is some of these exiles, protectors, firefighters, whatever, these parts feel like they have to take control, and then we blend with them, meaning that they feel like they are who we are. But if they can learn and become aware of the presence of capital S self and learn to trust self's leadership, then you have the confidence that is, typical of somebody who's self-led. Yeah,
confidence that the emotion will rise and fall. The trigger is a temporary activation. And the confidence, having walked through that over and over, that you can do it again, you can ride the wave.
Which dovetails nicely into courage, right? Like that gives you the courage to act and to be accountable for your actions. The courage to, I guess, that comes from feeling less vulnerable, because it's okay to be activated. Right? We feel really, really vulnerable when we're trying to protect these tender parts of us that we don't want activated. But if you can be okay with those, with activation and triggering, then you can walk your life path with more courage.
And it's not only okay, it's almost desirable, right? Like we've talked about triggers being friends to follow, and this idea of bring on the triggers. And I recently heard the story of Pema Chodron, who would go to Tibet and just had these beautiful experiences out there because the people of Tibet were so kind and so welcoming. But she worried that she wasn't getting the inner trigger practice by these trips. So she, it's kind of funny, I think it was in one of her books, talks about how decided to bring her IT person along who was really triggering for her to support some of the things she was doing on this trip because it is desirable to kind of unearth, highlight, and work on those areas of vulnerability that show up as triggers in life.
Yeah, and you're right. We have talked quite a bit about the utility of working with triggers, and I think IFS is a great tool for that, for those reasons.
And in fact, just to draw some more parallels, that's kind of a premise of Tantra work, and talking about not Tantra from a sexual spirituality path, but Tantra from a place of we are all interconnected, and we provoke each other. We bump into each other in life. Like I activate you, you activate me, and together we grow.
I love that. Yeah. And as we bump into each other, we sort of can smooth each other's edges, but we can also cause these creative fractals that only happen because two things collide in chaos, and
Yep, like atoms colliding.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of another C, the creativity. But when you're in, I think when Schwartz talks about it, he compares it to flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's concept of being in flow, of feeling like that the synergy between how challenging the stimulus is and how skilled you are is perfectly aligned. It's not unchallenging in the sense that it's boring, and it's not so challenging in the sense that it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book that our good friend Joe Flanders recommended, and that I've read more than once now, is Already Free.
I've read it.
Yeah, and there's just this one line in the chapter on relationships that stuck with me from the author, who's a psychologist and a Buddhist, kind of long-term Buddhist practitioner, meditator, who says it's interesting to be provoked. Like, that's part of being in relationship. And like, if you have that attitude of kind of this playful curiosity, or you're going to trigger me, I'm going to trigger you, that's how it works. But if we keep that those 8 C's on board as we do it, it can also be quite fruitful and manageable.
Yeah, I like that you're talking about relationship and being provoked in relationship. I guess the last C that we haven't talked about is connectedness.
Yeah.
And that's also a good segue to talk about parts in psychedelic therapy work, because, from the IFS perspective, connectedness not only with other humans, other souls, but connectedness internally, right? To be intrapsychically connected to all your parts, to have the system functioning as a healthy family led by the self, but also connected to the universe at large. Schwartz talks about not only IFS being a form of psychotherapy, but also a form of secular spirituality, almost like a spiritual practice.
And it might be helpful to just zoom out a little bit and look at the types of parts. The way internal family systems defines them is there are 2 main categories of parts: protectors and exiles. Protectors are the ones that usually show up first in day-to-day. 2 types of protectors. There are managers and firefighters. And the managers are the ones that might keep us busy or distracted from feeling things, or, they protect us from feeling pain in a frequent day-to-day kind of way. And the firefighters are the ones that come out with the big fire hose and blast something away or in the face when there's a risk of really touching a core wound or some old pain. Like those things that are dramatic and out of proportion, or that saying we use, when it's hysterical, it's historical. It's often a firefighter showing up. Yeah.
So maybe can you give an example of a manager? Like what might a manager part be like?
It could be something as simple as like checking your phone, just zoning out, or like just numbing out with TV or busyness, or that feeling we all have when we have some rare time and space where we could just sit and be. It's like the ones that pull us. Oh, they're going to say, it's dangerous to sit and be because you might feel stuff,
right?
And they'll pull you to go, just keep busy.
Yeah. So Schwartz talks about, I think I mentioned it before, blending with parts. So you might describe yourself as somebody who is restless, or who needs to be busy, who can't sit still, a perfectionist. And so these might be examples of manager parts that have sort of taken the role of your identity.
Whereas a firefighter part could be like an addictive pattern,
right? Your alcoholism.
Yeah, like going on an alcohol binge, for example, or just coming unhinged in relationship and like yelling things you may regret at your partner because you were triggered. And maybe even they just hit a button that's from an old wound, right?
Yeah. So what's the relationship between protectors and exiles?
So protectors are there to prevent the exiles from feeling more pain. Exiles would be like that wounded inner child. And I got to admit, the deeper I go in IFS, the more I realize that, well, one, the beauty and the simplicity of the model, but two, how there are some pieces that we don't often talk about or aren't often presented that I would find useful. Like, what do you call the healed parts? What do you call a system that's in harmony? On the one hand, IFS is a non-pathologizing model, which is great and not really dependent on diagnostic, but it also does focus on the fact that there are these protectors and exiles, where I think the goal is to get to the place where, there'll always be protectors, there'll always be wounds, but to have a system that's functioning harmoniously where exile may not be the right term anymore.
Yeah, so they might graduate from exile to something else. It might just be a part with
inner
a role.
child. Yeah.
And your inner child doesn't change in the sense that it's not that you get rid of it, you excise it. But I think, one of the steps to the therapy is bringing self-energy to these parts, all of the types, so that they heal whatever they're carrying, and that they're willing to offer up or let go of the role that they've taken on in favor of a more functional role. So the inner critic who's been trying to make you perfect so that you wouldn't get rejected, protecting the exile that feels wounded by rejection, sees the damage that it's done, decides to trust the self, right? The capital S self, and is now going to no longer be the inner critic in the damaging sense, but is going to be, your inner COO, who's going to say, well, this is how things probably ought to operate if we want to achieve this goal. But it's letting go of the violence that it was using to get you to see things and to keep you perfect.
Yeah, I like that. I have my IFS notebook here in front of me, and it's reminding me of something I wrote down on page 1, which is the goal of IFS is the first point, release parts from extreme roles. So there can be that more peace, joy, connectedness, and spirituality on board. And then by doing that, you're restoring more trust in the core self, to use the term you like, and you're getting more towards that inner balance and wholeness, and bringing more self-energy to how you show up in the world.
Yeah. So, and it's not that you need, I think even in his books, Schwartz talks about that he himself is very rarely always floating around perfectly aligned and harmonized with his parts. So it's not a path to perfection, but I think it's a path to, I like just the idea of harmonizing to self-energy or to core self-energy. But it's hard to do it if you're not aware of the constellation of selves in there. Yeah, that awareness is huge. Just another practical takeaway that I've used hundreds of times, more than I can count, personally, is just naming a part, just shedding a bit of awareness on a light of awareness on it when something is activated goes a long way. Like there's this idea in emotion focused therapy, you've got to name it to tame it. Like label your emotion as part of the path to regulating it. But I think the same applies to parts. It's like, oh, that's my kind of rowdy protector part that just got its button pushed, and it's okay. That's a part of me, and I'm working on it, and that can help it calm down just by the awareness. Yeah, I had some clients come up with some fun names for their parts. Like one of my clients called her inner critic the judgment fairy. Yeah. Like, oh, that's the judgment fairy, here to bestow the blessings of, and criticism, of self-criticism. My kids, at least one of my kids, calls it glitch brain when he's having intrusive thoughts that are really self-critical, because, he's a video gamer and the concept of a glitch makes sense to him. And so he's like, oh, Dad, I had this thought. I think it's glitch brain. I'm like, oh, yeah, let's talk about glitch brain. What's glitch brain trying to do? Glitch
brain part.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like giving parts as much kind of color and personality as you can. It just helps in that building a relationship with parts. That's one other big takeaway from the model in terms of working with clients, is just helping people develop a relationship with the part, staying with it, spending time with it, not rushing, and then trusting that the self energy, the self essence knows what the parts need to do to heal and transform.
Yeah.
Like the inner healer we talk about.
Yeah, I think those two concepts overlap a lot.
Yeah.
And I think, we we have a hard out today, and I want to make sure we get to psychedelics, because for me, my personal work with psychedelics probably set me up well to really love IFS. And I don't think it's an accident, not only because Schwartz has been ambitious in this regard, but I don't think it's an accident that a lot of psychedelic therapy programs, training programs, and psychedelic therapists are drawn to IFS. There's something about a psychedelic experience that can display parts to you powerfully, and especially if you prime the landscape in your preparation with some parts understanding, a lot can be accomplished. And I remember an early psilocybin experience I had, moving in and out of parts with a fluidity that I'd never experienced before. And some people talk about psychedelics sort of grabbing the protectors and throwing them in the cellar forcefully, and that you can get this rebounding effect after coming out of a psychedelic experience where the protectors come back with a vengeance. Like, hey man, I didn't consent to being thrown into the cellar. I get that you had this blissful experience, but this wasn't okay. So just sort of scattering those things on the table with respect to parts and psychedelics.
It's a good way to look at it. I think, look at the MDMA assisted therapy manual and the history of it. Dick Schwartz and Michael Mithoff are friends, and they and Michael and Annie were well informed in kind of a parts work lens, and it shows up in the MDMA therapy, especially if someone kind of under the influence of a psychedelic or through the course of therapy goes spontaneously into something that looks like parts work. You can join them there or help gently guide them, again, trusting their inner healer and trusting the unfolding. But with MDMA, with ketamine, we've done it in countless ways, including what you're saying. You and I did that ketamine study for eating disorders where we were doing a guided trigger work practice before sessions and to till the soil. And I thought that was really productive.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can dovetail really nicely, because you were talking earlier about the word that came to my mind was externalization. Like when you name your parts and you give them all the color and personality that you can, like you described, it helps you create a little bit of distance between self energy and parts, enough distance that you can actually notice the energy of a particular part when it shows up. And I think, psychedelics almost do that on steroids, or at least they can, if you till the soil in the way that you described.
Yeah, and they can help you. What you're describing sounds to me a lot like equanimity too. That putting a bit of a distance without dissociating from. Right. Like just naming something helps you hold it all. Like accept that it's there, but slip back into that capital S self. And in my experience and, having seen this in other clients, you can either slip into that kind of really blissful, helpful, useful state during a psychedelic experience, or you can get blended with a part. You can really get thrown into a part full force, which also can be useful if held in the right way. They can be a little trickier.
Yeah, I definitely have had that experience personally, and I've seen my clients have that experience where a part has the microphone in a way so completely, like that they have never had while sober, while in normal consciousness.
So they have to go to the quiet room.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Or, we were on a call the other day, a supervision call in one of our clinical trials with the therapists on the clinical trial, and somebody was talking about a psychedelic research participant being sort of unhinged during the whole session, trying to leave, ran and slammed up against the window, And then afterward, the person reflecting on what had happened and being a little mortified by this part that sort of showed up and took the steering wheel for the duration of the experience.
That's, I think, a good caveat or a good note for people working in this space as therapists, guides, because we've seen that, to varying degrees in ketamine work, for example, where you can really, you can be kind of disinhibited or in a non-ordinary state where you can blend with that part, and that could show up as in a difficult session kind of way for the therapist, of having to hold someone in their old flashback trigger that they've just embodied.
Yeah. I know we got to wrap up here soon, but I want to tell this story real quick about one of my kids. So my middle son, super creative kid, quiet and shy, but he's always been very interested in dreams and in lucid dreaming. I mean, for years, even when he was younger, he wanted to, Dad, how do I lucid dream? How do I control my dreams? So he's been playing around with lucid dreaming. And yesterday I was telling him we were talking about parts, and he's like, Dad, what I like to do is I like to meet the different parts of myself in my dreams, because really everything that shows up in my dreams is just me. It's coming from me. It's all parts of me. So I like to lucid dream because I feel like I get to know myself a lot better by encountering these different characters in my dreams. And he's like, sometimes I can prime it. If I want to get to know something, or if I want to play with a character, I'll think about it in detail as I fall asleep. And then more often than not, that character shows up in my dream, and then I can get to know myself. I was like, oh my gosh, my son's having these full non-ordinary state experiences in his dreamscape.
Yeah, that's really cool, especially at that age.
Yeah.
Because lucid dreaming is fascinating. It's a little bit hard to pin down and kind of a lifelong practice I found, but I still find myself doing that pretty often, is trying to take a question into dream space. And it doesn't always work, or isn't always remembered, but if you have a kind of a meditation or an intention, I find at night, and a notebook nearby, I've found that some insights really come out of the dream state that you can capture. It's pretty fun. Yeah.
Any final words before we wrap up on parts?
Well, no, I think my final thought is we should dive into this some more, because there's a big, vast world to explore parts work. But what I've found personally and in working with people is that changes in the inner family, the inner system, go a long way in changes in how you show up in the world, like more self-led. There can be high yields from doing even a little bit of this work.
Yeah, strongly encouraged. Well, thanks, Reid.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.